From this,
and they called me anti-vax, but I've never said anything to anybody to make anybody think I'm anti-vax.
To this.
I recently declared myself an independent candidate for President of the United States.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of one of the most famous political dynasties in America, independent candidate for the 2024 US presidency, and, depending on who you listen to, a noble opponent of corporate evils.
The tsunami of money has poured into Washington from the pharmaceutical companies, from the military contracts, from the oil industry, the coal industry, the chemical industry.
Or one of the worst spreaders of misinformation across social media.
He lives in an amazing world of denialism where he simply denies the facts that are in front of him, and children die around him, and he continues to ignore that. He's a dangerous, dangerous man.
He's the nephew of President John F. Kennedy and son of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Both were assassinated when Kennedy Jr. was a child. Kennedy started his run as a candidate for the Democrats, but switched to be independent in October last year. In a system that favours the two main political parties, pundits say he's polling better than an independent candidate has in decades. He seems to be appealing to a group fed up with what feels like the same old choices.
So we have money for wars, and we have money for bankers that need bailouts. But what happens to the American people when they are on hard times?
But his run has also rung alarm bells for many. They point to his almost 2-decade record as one of the US's most prolific spreaders of health misinformation, something that, during the COVID pandemic, got several of his social media accounts banned.
And we need to talk about bioweapons. COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted.
It's these acts of censorship that are part of the very reason Kennedy says he's running for president.
I was living in a world where nothing I said was reported. So I was not allowed to defend myself. Nobody would talk to me.
Now he's a presidential candidate, social media companies have reversed their bans. He can't be stopped from speaking.
This is what happens when you censor somebody for 18 years.
This is BBC Trending, and I'm Rachel Schreyer, the BBC's health and disinformation reporter. In this episode of our Power series, I'm trying to understand two very different images that exist of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who could decide the results of the US election. Over the course of a series of dreary winter days, from a little orange pod in BBC HQ, I log on to video calls.
My name's Aaron Everett. I live in Colorado. I work in real estate development.
My name is Bryce. I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Currently, I run about 5 coffee shops within the local area.
My name's Jay. I live over in Austin. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was actually born in Jamaica.
I'm meeting a series of Kennedy supporters from across the political spectrum to find out why he's winning their vote.
I've always leaned more towards the Democrats, and I was extremely excited about Bernie Sanders' run in 2016.
Yeah, for most of my voting life, I have voted Republican.
My voting record is all over the place.
The issues closest to their hearts vary, but there are some common threads.
I would say civil liberties have become the most important issue to me, as well as protecting free speech.
Corporate capture is number one.
His conversation around surveillance, I think his conversation around civil liberties, I think his conversations around regenerative agriculture, I think his positions on the border are all much more significant to us as citizens than his particular positions on vaccines. That is so low on my totem pole in terms of why I support him.
He's drawn people in with wide-ranging policies, from controlling borders to legalising marijuana. He has a record as an environmental lawyer of winning cases against powerful companies that pollute. And he's promising to crack down on the influence of corporate interests on government. And most of all,
he felt like an honest person.
I trust the man who has sued a bunch of these government agencies and won.
I would call him a courageous truth teller.
But, if you're going to speak truth to power, you should at least tell the truth.
That last voice you heard was Professor Paul Offit, a highly respected paediatrician specialising in infectious diseases. He co-invented a vaccine against rotavirus, which is estimated to save as many as 2,000 lives a day in the developing world.
So about 20 years ago, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. called me, and he said that he needed my help.
In the 1990s, concerns began to be raised that a mercury-based preservative called thimerosal in vaccines might be linked to a rise in conditions, including autism. Kennedy had been speaking to worried parents.
They were worried that that preservative could harm their children. Could I provide him with any information that would be reassuring?
And Paul did have studies to send him. A number had been done over the years which found children receiving these vaccines were no worse off. And anyway, this ingredient had been taken out of most US vaccines by 2001, just to be extra cautious.
So I went through those studies with him. He seemed satisfied, and I thought that was the end of it.
But a year or so later, Paul got a surprise.
He published an article in Rolling Stone magazine basically saying that I lied to him, that the only reason that I had said that mercury-containing preservative was safe was because I had been the co-inventor of a vaccine that also contained that preservative, which was completely untrue.
Paul's vaccine had never contained thimerosal. Rolling Stone eventually withdrew the article, toppled by a mountain of corrections. But the genie was out of the bottle. Yet, as he campaigns to be president, Kennedy still tells this story. His version. The version where Paul Offit only reassured him about the vaccine's safety for his own cynical ends.
I think he's remarkably dishonest.
We put Paul Offit's comments to Kennedy's team, but they did not provide any response in relation to these specific allegations. Kennedy has repeatedly said he's been censored by mainstream media. Full disclosure, he was part of a lawsuit against the BBC and other news media organisations, claiming they and social platforms colluded to censor him and others so they couldn't compete with them. But since his presidential run has seen him back in the news, Kennedy has been confronted with evidence that seems to pretty clearly show him straying from the facts. CNN anchor Casey Hunt challenged him in December.
Over the summer in an interview, you said, quote, "There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective." Do you still believe that?
I never said that.
So stop me. We have the clip. Please play the clip.
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
A vast body of independent evidence from around the world show this isn't accurate. But for some people, the very fact Kennedy is saying something contrary to the mainstream, that he has been fact-checked and criticised for spreading disinformation, it makes him more trustworthy, not less, even where there are good, independent data that suggest he's getting the facts wrong.
They said that he was someone who should absolutely not be listened to. That made me listen to him a lot more.
Who's actually the fact checker? Do they have anything that might benefit them from being a fact checker?
His supporters point to some very real instances of failings by institutions as reasons they don't trust the mainstream and trust Kennedy instead. Just because one source has been wrong in the past, though, it doesn't logically follow that anyone saying the opposite is right. It's a difficult bind. Institutions do sometimes try to cover things up. There might be very legitimate reasons to be sceptical. People in power also get things wrong unintentionally, or the facts simply change, and they change their positions accordingly. But once you've lost trust in authorities, no amount of fact-checking is going to make you believe they might ever be right.
And I think it becomes much more difficult when you look at something like the opioid crisis, where we know, and everyone is in agreement, that the pharmaceutical companies were completely corrupt and completely profit-driven.
Olivia Nuzzi, the Washington correspondent for New York Magazine, went to meet Kennedy in October of last year.
And we went on a hike together in Brentwood in Los Angeles, where he lives. He's got these 3 enormous dogs who joined us for the hike. And he's got this van that he calls the dog van. It's very beat up. The mirrors smashed. There are no seatbelts because the dogs have chewed them off. There's no back seat.
Olivia tells me he was cautious about talking to her as a mainstream journalist. It's clear he doesn't feel the press has given him a fair hearing, and he hasn't really needed them.
He has been able to run this campaign talking directly to his supporters on social media, being able to sit down with Joe Rogan for 3 hours for an interview. It's far more powerful than getting, an endorsement from the New York Times, right? And I think a lot of his supporters probably came across him in that way.
Without the traditional party machinery, Kennedy, the independent, has had to lean on his existing and growing following via alternative and social media. And it seems to be a more comfortable home for him anyway. On TikTok, he does push-ups and takes the viewer hunting with falcons.
That's a fit boy.
He asks simple questions that many do want the answer to. Why are so many of us sick? Who profits from war? Why can't you buy a home? And in the long, winding podcast conversations Kennedy uses to set out his stall, he seems to have those answers. His sentences are littered with statistics. They sound trustworthy, rooted in evidence. But when you dig deeper into any of his claims, each one opens up a Pandora's box of context. Take this claim made last summer on Joe Rogan's podcast.
They are exempt from pre-licensing safety testing.
Kennedy regularly says he's not anti-vaccine, he's pro-vaccine safety. All he wants is for vaccines to be properly tested. It all sounds very reasonable. Except this claim.
They don't have to be tested. And they're not. Not one of these vaccines has ever been tested pre-licensing in a placebo-controlled trial.
It's not true. New vaccines are tested against a control group who don't receive the vaccine before being approved. But if scientists want to make any updates, the new formulations get tested against the original vaccine. That's because we already have safety data on the old vaccine, so we can compare the two. We contacted Kennedy's team for comment, and they stood by his position. In an email, they said, proper safety studies have never been conducted on vaccines. Long-term all-cause mortality studies comparing fully vaccinated children to never vaccinated children. Kennedy has long highlighted rises in specific conditions like autism. He says questions need to be asked about whether vaccines are responsible for those increases. Vaccine scientist Paul Offit says that research has already been done.
Well, so it's perfectly reasonable to ask the question. That study has been done 18 times in 7 different countries on 3 different continents, and the results have always been the same. You were at no greater risk of autism if you got that MMR vaccine or if you didn't.
The rise in conditions like autism and ADHD is thought by many experts in the field to be mostly down to better diagnosis and broader definitions. A law passed in 1989 to help Americans with disabilities get support and welfare might also have contributed to more people seeking a formal diagnosis.
All the other things he claims has been studied and shown not to be true. The difference is he doesn't believe those studies. He simply thinks everybody's in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry and that you should only trust him.
This is important because if Kennedy did make it into office, he suggested he'd want childhood vaccines to be retested. In a statement to the BBC, Kennedy said, "I am not going to take away anyone's vaccines. Rather, I'm going to ensure that all vaccines are subjected to proper, unbiased testing by researchers who are free from big pharma influence." He added if he were president, he would free all regulatory agencies from what he called industry capture to rebuild trust in government. But the kind of testing he's talking about would mean asking some people in the placebo arm to take the risk of catching a disease we already know we can safely protect them against. Paul Offit explains.
What he's asking is for something that's utterly unethical and that no one would ever do.
Yet, he's speaking to some very profound, genuine feelings of anger and disappointment. Writer and activist Naomi Klein says Kennedy and others like him get the facts wrong, but the feelings right. As Olivia Nuzzi explains,
people are very, very, very fed up. And I think the tendency to kind of laugh him off and say, oh, well, he's just a vaccine kook. Who cares about what he's saying? We shouldn't give him the time of day. I think that is sort of a mistake.
Not least because he could decide the election, even if he doesn't perform that well himself.
I mean, for RFK, to completely screw things up for either major party, he does not have to win. He does not need to do very well at all. I mean, I'm in Arizona right now. If RFK were to get, 3, 4, 5% in this election, he could completely tip the outcome of Arizona and, take it away from Biden or from Trump. And one swing state moving in one direction or the other could completely define the outcome of the election.
Olivia is resistant to the idea people need to be protected from what she calls dangerous words, including by restricting how much of Kennedy's speeches get broadcast, even if they contain falsehoods.
A large part of the appeal of someone like Mr. Kennedy, where there's this belief that people in the press are condescending and think that the American public are idiots, and people don't like that. And I think that's why you have people gravitating towards unfiltered forms of media like podcasts.
But what of those who do feel harmed by bad information? It all started for Lydia Green when her first child was born in 2008, when her daughter seemed to be crying excessively after getting her first round of shots. Lydia became worried, but when she called her nurse, she felt dismissed.
They basically said, "You're just a first-time mom, you just have anxiety," almost like I was making it up or something.
So she went online to ask questions. And a list of influencers, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr., were there to validate her worst fears. As time went on, she began to see more and more clips of him, hooking her further in. Invisible threats targeting her children were everywhere. She was overwhelmingly, exhaustingly afraid.
Having my fears validated by people like RFK and others, it left me stuck there a lot longer than I needed to be.
For Lydia, though, the biggest impact was on her middle son, who's since been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. For years, she ignored the signs, delaying getting him support. He was unvaccinated, she thought, so he couldn't be autistic.
In these anti-vaccine groups, autism is described as the worst possible outcome for your child. It is very ableist, it's very awful, there's nothing redeeming. And so when I had this beautiful boy, and he really is the sweetest child, I couldn't reconcile those two ideas.
It was only when she began to seek different sources of information and distance herself from the anti-vaccine community in 2020 that she sought help. Now, she runs a grassroots movement called Back to the Vax to support parents like herself. And she feels her son suffered because she listened to the likes of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Lydia is aware that influencers like Kennedy weren't the only factor. It was a bad experience with healthcare that first led her down her path. For many Kennedy supporters, it was a mix of media and government scandals that lost their trust. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is more than ready to step in and fill the vacuum with his own version of the truth.
If you give me a sword and some ground to stand on, I'll take your country back for you, but I need your help.
That's it for this episode of BBC Trending, reported and produced by me, Rachel Schreyer. It was mixed by Annie Gardner. The editor was Ed Main. If you want to get in touch, then you can do so by emailing me at rachel.schreyer, that's SCHRAER, at bbc.co.uk.